Welcome to the first podcast with me, Michael Hobson. Today we're going to be looking at social influences on participation in PE and sport. Now, just a little bit of background on this topic area. This tends to be a very popular topic area with some of our second and third years when they come to do either their dissertation or their research project in their second year. What I'm going to try to do today is to try and help you guys start to understand how research in this area looks, what you would do when you're writing a literature review about this topic area, and then start to consider some of the different types of data in this topic area. We're going to look at this from a very broad sense. So in comparison to somebody like Jason or Helen, who are going to look specifically at inclusion or specifically at females in sport in their podcasts, I'm going to cover a number of different areas which we would consider as a social science. So we'll look at things like women, we'll look at things like race, we'll look at things like ethnicity, socioeconomic status, etc. Now, when you come to write your podcast, when you come to write your literature review, I'm going to reiterate that as you go through, you should really only focus on one of these areas. But some of the principles we're going to talk about today can be very broad, and these principles we can apply to all of them. So that's kind of the idea behind today's podcast. Okay, so the first thing is that this podcast, although it is going to be in some senses like a traditional lecture, in other senses it's not going to be. I'm going to ask you to do a number of tasks as we go through. With these tasks, what I would ask you to do is to engage via Twitter. So I might set you a task, and what I would like you to do is either tweet at myself or tweet at the Physical and Sport Education Twitter account. And what I want you to do is use the following hashtags. You either use PSE4001 or sport participation. Ideally, you use them both, because there will be other people who use Twitter on this topic area, on this module. Therefore, we need to have specific hashtags for this topic area. Now, I know some of you may not have Twitter at this time, or you may not be following us as a program, or you might not be following myself. So the first thing that you need to do so that we can engage properly within this module is you need to now add either the Physical and Sport Education degree program or myself. So I'm going to give you a minute. If you don't have a Twitter account, you're going to take this time just to pause the presentation and set up a Twitter account. Okay, so that's the first thing I'm going to ask you to do. The second thing I'm going to ask you to do is, as an ongoing task through today's presentation, just to break the ice a little and take away some of the Twitter tension, I'm going to ask you at some stage during the presentation to send me a picture of your concentration face, just so you can show me that you're concentrating, that you're engaged, and that you're really, really interested. Please keep it clean, but yeah, if you can do that. So if you could pause the presentation now. Once you've paused it, could you do the following task? Thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully having set up your Twitter account and hopefully having followed us or myself on Twitter, you're now ready to take part in some of the interactive parts of the session. The first thing which we're going to look at is actually defining the point, what participation. Now, I know that seems very simple, and I know it's something which maybe seems very easy to do. Now, when you come to write your literature review, to give direction to your literature review, this is something that you really, really need to do. If you haven't defined participation, then it's very difficult for you to have direction within your writing. Okay? Now, there's a couple of points that I want you to think about when you do this. The first is, don't just get an Oxford Dictionary definition. A, it's not necessarily very good academic practice, but B, it probably won't give you the direction for your study. On lots of occasions, if you're writing and you read academic work, what you see they'll do within their introduction is they'll maybe actually consider 2 or 3 definitions and state the one which they think is most appropriate for their study, or state the one which they're using and the reason why. And that's something which we would like you to do within this literature review. So when you look at participation, within your introduction, it'll be one of your key themes which you define. Okay, so ideally you would have looked at a couple of different perspectives on participation, and you would justify the one which you're using. This should come from academic sources, ideally. So this should come from other papers which look at participation in sport. Now that other paper might not be looking at your specific group, it might not be looking at specific individuals that you are writing about, but there should be an academic definition of participation there. So considering what other authors have used and other backgrounds will ultimately impact your choice when you come to define participation. I hope that makes sense. If we move on, what I've got here are physical activity guidelines for the Department of Health. Now, the Department of Health is a government organisation. The current guidelines you can see on the screen are the guidelines for 5 to 18-year-olds. Now, the Department for Health would actually measure participation by this, okay? So their target is to get people to take part in physical activity for at least 60 minutes, up to several hours every day. So if you look at that, when they are doing research, what they'll be considering in terms of participation is, are people taking part in moderate to vigorous, intensive physical activity for at least 60 minutes a day, up to several hours a day, every day of the week. And you can see there that they've actually, to do that, they've actually defined vigorous intensity activity, and they've actually defined what all children should do to minimise the time being spent sedentary. So that, for me, would be one definition of participation we could consider. It's not the only definition, but I think that's a government guideline which, when they come to do their research, this is their definition they would be using. And this would focus their study, because ultimately they are looking at how much physical activity people are doing and how often they're doing it. Now that would fit under the remit of participation. And as you see as we go on, they've also done similar guidelines for 19 to 64-year-olds, so for adults. And you can see that actually the recommendations change slightly. So again, when they're doing research, if they were looking at adults, which is a different social group to children and young people, they would be measuring against these recommendations for participation. Now, I'm not saying this is the right thing to consider. I'm not saying this is the only thing to consider. But what I am saying is you can see there that it's a very structured definition for participation. What you're getting here and what the research in this area is likely to be a lot more statistical. As I said, it's how much they're doing and how often they're doing it. Ultimately, what it isn't telling us is if people are taking part or they're not taking part, what are those reasons for it? And a lot of the research done by the Department of Health is actually looking at how many people are taking part. Okay? So if that is what you'd be researching, this would be a good definition to use. However, you guys aren't doing a research project. All we're asking you to do is a literature review. So if you're doing a literature review, you're not going to answer this question of how much are people doing and how often are they doing it. We're not doing a secondary research or a primary research project. We're just looking at literature, okay? And we are synthesizing that information and we're bringing that together to answer a question about a focus of a certain group. So that's something you should consider. So that although this is a good guideline for physical activity and a good way to define participation, it's possibly not the right way for you guys. It might be something that you want to allude to and you want to reference in your introduction to say this is one way which participation can be looked at, but it's probably not the right one to look at for you guys, okay? Now, the second definition of participation I've gone for isn't a definition as such, okay? What you see here is more a picture, I guess, and it's considering taking part, all right? Now, what you would need to do if you were going to use this is start to look at a particular group, so whether it is race, whether it is gender, whether it is class, whether it's disability, and ultimately what this slide is about, or what this definition is about, is what are the barriers to stop people from taking part. And I think if you're looking at specific groups and participation, that's kind of more of the approach you're going to go down because you're doing a literature review. You're not looking at statistics, how many people are doing how much. So when it comes to that, that's kind of your focus, I think. All right. Now, you've got to define what you mean by taking part. So, is it just a specific activity and a specific group, and are there particular barriers for a specific group to take part in that activity? If that is how you're going to be looking at participation within your literature review, then that's what you consider. If it was more, how many are people doing physical activity once a week? So, are there people from a disability group who are they taking part in it once a week? What are the reasons for that? It changes slightly. My advice is to go back, is to look at other research which looks at participation, look at their introduction, look at the definitions they use, and frame your work within this. Ultimately, some of the papers we'll look at later on, the work by Bradbury and by Kay, within their introduction they make it clear what they mean by participation. And although it is a focus on taking part, they make it quite clear and quite structured. I would look at some of their work, some of the other work of people who have looked at particular social groups and their reasons for taking part in sport, and use that as a referencing point. That's not to say copy it completely, but use that to inform your position when you start your literature review. Okay? Alright, so I'm going to set you a task now because I'm aware that I've talked for nearly 10 minutes and you must be feeling really bored. I'm going to ask you to either use social networking or use your contacts that you know, okay? And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to find somebody that you know and ask them for their reasons about not taking part in sport or physical activity. I would say for now, avoid a specific group because you haven't got ethical approval to deal with that sensitive data. So don't start talking about religion, race, ethnicity, class, disability. Don't ask those questions, but just maybe post on Facebook or on Twitter, "Hi guys, I'm just doing a university research project. Could you help me to understand if you don't take part in sport, what are the reasons why you don't?" Alternatively, you could ring your mum. You could text someone you know. What I would like you to do is find that information out and then tweet me some of your most interesting answers. Okay? So if you can do that now, if you can take 5 minutes or so to do that, you might not get the response straight away, but once you get the response and once you get that data, if you could tweet that at me, that'd be fantastic. Okay. Okay. So, hopefully you've done the task, all right? And hopefully you will have done the task, and hopefully you will have got a bit of background on reasons why people choose not to participate in sport. And you might see some of these reasons cropping up. Now, what I've got here is some of the work by an author called John Evans, who is based up at Loughborough University. Now, Evans is one of the key thinkers on sociology of sport. And what you can see is, ultimately, it's a graph, okay? And down both sides, he's got the different factors which impact upon people's participation in physical education or sport. Now, you see, going down vertically, we've got things such as class, race, gender, and disability. Now, for me, and for John Evans, these would be considered to be personal characteristics. So, class, race, gender, and disability aren't societal in such that they're not society influencing or stopping people from taking part. These are personal characteristics which are individual to a person. Whereas if you go across, we've got things like media, families, schools, and the workplace. Those are more what I would consider to be societal characteristics. Those are things which are social institutions, if you like. So the family has its own particular rules. It has its own cultural rules. It has its own cultural norms. The media does, schools do, and so on. Now, these cultural rules, these cultural norms, will have an influence on the way that people think and on the way that people act. And ultimately, participation in PE and sport will be influenced by that. The thing to get your head around is that class will be impacted by the media, by family, schools, at the workplace and so on, as do all the other personal characteristics. So in some senses they overlap. Race and the family, gender and schools, gender and the media, you will find a lot of research on these topic areas. They will overlap and they will impact each other. The social institutions will impact the personal institutions. Okay? What I would like you to do is just spend a minute to pause the video again and maybe just look at the personal characteristics and look at the social characteristics, and just maybe put a cross on the ones where you think, yes, you have been influenced by it. So if it is gender and it is schools, and possibly you went to an all-girls school, or you went to an all-boys school, or you went to a mixed school, and that's influenced your participation in certain sports and activities, maybe just put a cross on there for yourself. You don't have to share this with anyone else. You don't have to tweet this at me because this is your own personal experiences. But if you could just do that, just to get you thinking about these different fields, it would be a very good thing for you to do. Okay, so just take that minute. Okay, so thank you for doing the previous task. What I'm just going to do now is just to look at these areas in slightly more depth, okay? Because hopefully you've all looked at how the media or how schools have impacted you and impacted you's gender, race, class and disability. The first thing that I'm going to say is there are other fields that I could have looked at. I could have mentioned age and I could have mentioned sexuality. But for this, I've decided not to. And there's particular reasons behind that, but we're not going to go into that today. Now, what I just want to highlight to you is actually, when you write, you have to be careful about what terms you use. For example, gender and sex will often be used interchangeably. Now, when we do research and when we write a literature review, we've got to be careful by that. Because actually, if I'm coming from a sociological standpoint, which a lot of you will be doing because you are looking at what are the factors that have impacted me taking part, your focus will be on gender. Because gender is about how society views male and female, masculine and feminine. Okay? So ultimately, there's a difference between gender and sex, where sex would be something to be considered more biological. Your sex is determined by your reproductive organs. So if you're a male, you have certain reproductive organs. If you're female, you have particular reproductive organs. Now, actually, the society we live in, there's some blurred lines between that. But ultimately, gender is defined by cultural practices, cultural norms, and cultural beliefs. So it is possible for somebody to be transgender and actually be living as a female because they are conforming to those cultural beliefs, those cultural norms and those behaviours of a female. So when you start to use those terms, try to avoid using them interchangeably because that will ultimately impact your own quality of writing. The same with race and ethnicity. If I was to consider ethnicity, that's about your heritage, your skin tone, whereas race is again something which can be more culturally developed. So if I have Ethiopian parents, my ethnicity is African, okay? But actually, the idea of race is something which is culturally developed. Same with class, same with disability. We could argue with disability that actually it's more society that has the impact on whether someone is disabled or not. Whereas the fact is, if somebody has an illness or an impairment, they have that biological condition. However, whether they are able or disabled to do something is ultimately determined by the way which society is set up. The biological characteristics are things that you will see more in things like Sport England surveys. And if you see largely used surveys, going back to the earlier point made about participation, you will see things like sex, ethnicities, level of income, and so on. Because they are measuring that. So if you come to tick a box to say how many times you do sport a week, you would tick a box to say I am male or female. And that would be your sex. Whereas the social constructs of gender aren't being asked there. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to move on to do a specific task. If you go onto Sims Capital, you see that I've put up there the Sport England Active People Survey Summary. This survey looks at how many people take part in particular sports from particular groups at least once a week. Okay, so if I just escape this for a second, I will show you on Sims Capital what we've got. So we've got if you go on the course Learning to Learn 4001, you go down to the week of the 24th of October. It says Active People Survey Summary. If you click that to open that up, okay, it comes up slightly differently for me because it's on a Mac. What you see is you'll see some statistics. So you've got some statistics about how many people taking part once a week, and if you go down to the bottom, what you will then see is a breakdown depending upon gender, ethnicity, and disability, age groups as well. Okay, what I'm going to ask you to do is just take some time to have a look at a few questions. All right. So what I want you to think about is, first of all, what are your thoughts about this data? Does it kind of make sense to you? Does it shock you? Okay. Second of all, is there anything that surprises you about the stats? The next question is there any weaknesses in this data? So what does it tell you? In terms of research, I've got these statistics here saying 2.658 million people from ethnic groups play sport once a week. But what are the weaknesses about that? And the second thing is, where and how might you use this data into your literature review? Okay, so if you could just do that. Once you've done that, I'm going to ask you to tweet me your thoughts. Okay, so using the hashtags PSE4001 and sport participation, if you can tweet me your thoughts to inform me your answers to those questions on that data. Okay, so if you just want to take a minute or so to do that, and then we can move on from there. Okay, so hopefully you've seen some of that statistical data, and you've got some thoughts about strengths, and you've got some thoughts about weaknesses, and you've got some thoughts about things that shock you. Now, for me, there's some interesting things about that data. Ultimately, it tells you how many people are doing how much. What it doesn't necessarily do is really look at the reasons why. All right? Now, that is almost what you would call a positivist research, the previous stuff. It's just giving you statistics. It's just saying, this is a fact. This is how many people are doing this. On the other hand, what we've got here, I would argue, when we look at class, race, gender and disability, as opposed to socioeconomic status, ethnicity, sexuality, and illnesses and impairments, is what we call interpretivist data. In the sense that this research looks at interpreting feelings, it looks at understanding emotions, it looks at understanding experiences, and trying to unpick why people don't participate. So, what you've got here is you can see some examples of different areas for each group. When we talk about BME, we're talking about black minority ethnic groups. Okay, so that is anybody who isn't in the white Christian majority. So that's something, first of all, that stands out to me. If you look, I've just given some examples of different things we might look at. So, for example, from an interpretive perspective, we need to focus our research. So, I might look at gender. If I'm looking at gender, I'm going to consider possibly things such as how body image encourages participation or discourages participation. So it might be within females, how do their view of a healthy body image impact their participation in sport or outside of sport? It may be that they view a more sporty physique as being more masculine. And there will be more factors to understand why they don't do that. Other things, for example, sport-specific studies for dropout or participation, again, can have an impact, which may link to that body image. Things like combat sports and sports that are traditionally seen as being masculine will have an impact upon participation. So, for an example is a dissertation student of mine last year looked at judo, and she looked at the reasons why girls dropped out of judo. Because that's seen as a combat sport. Combat sports are seen as something which are possibly linked with more masculine behaviours. I'm not going to go into that too much because that's something that Jason will be looking at. On the other hand, what you can see is there's other studies that look at possible underrepresentation. So I've got class and I've got race next to each other. Okay, so one of those studies might be the underrepresentation of Asian males fit into that category of BME, black minority ethnic groups, within football. Now, again, we've got to be careful with that because that underrepresentation occurs at a professional level. But there is a big difference between professional and grassroots. So be careful when you go into that. But that's an example of an area you could look at. It could be a number of other areas, okay? It could be, if we're looking at class, underrepresentations of lower socioeconomic status within rowing. I'm just throwing out some massive stereotypes there. But those are some of the things that you come to look at. When it comes to interpretivist data, ultimately it's looking at understanding the experiences, the feelings, the emotions, all of those things as to why people see either a healthy body image in a certain way or don't participate in a sport and so on. So it's understanding why. And I think within your literature review, that's ultimately what we'd like you to do a little bit more of. Societal factors, I would argue, kind of cross-correlate. So the family and the media, you could do specific studies on them, but ultimately those studies would be stronger when they're associated to a particular group. So whether it is class, gender, disability, so on, how that family support or how the media impacts that, again, is stronger if you link it to there. Right, now this is the key thing for me, okay? When you come to do your research, when you come to write your literature review, you are going to look at the six available podcasts and write a review of academic peer-reviewed literature on this topic. Now, for me, I know I've been quite broad, and I know that Jason is looking at gender in future weeks, Helen's going to be looking at disability, and there's maybe opportunities to look at other groups. I would say that you would focus upon one group. If you were to pick the topic of sports participation, you focus upon one group, whether that is black minority ethnic groups in terms of race, whether that is disability, whether that's class, or whether that is gender. You focus on that one particular group when you write that literature. What you then do is unpick themes from within. Now, the slide which I showed you before with all the different topic areas, you've got to be careful, okay, not to pick and choose from too many topic areas. For example, if you wanted to focus on females, then body image would be one theme, and I guess another theme you could look at is masculine perceptions and sports and so on. Now, they would be different themes within that, and I think they would be fine to look at them together. But what you don't want to do is look at class, gender, and race all in one presentation. Ultimately, you should choose one and look at that and keep that focus. There will be, from the research you read, there will be themes that arise. And what you need to do is, as opposed to describing, this is one paper, this is a second paper, this is a third paper, you need to highlight the common themes from those papers. So it might be, if you're looking at BME groups, it might be that the cultural context keeps coming up, okay? So their cultural norms and values and beliefs. And it might be that that's appeared in 3 or 4 papers. So as opposed to saying, Bradbury et al. Says this, Kay et al. Says that, your focus is picking out the key themes and grouping them together. So if Bradbury, Kay, Hobson and Wigham all say the same thing, bring that together and use that as one paragraph. So it might be upon cultural context. It could be one paragraph positively on the cultural context. You then bring another paragraph in negatively looking at the cultural context. And then your next paragraph would look at a different theme. Okay? But avoid writing about this is what this paper says. Go through multiple papers and highlight different themes and different topics within those papers and then pick, I would say, at most 3 or 4 common themes that arise from the literature in multiple bits of literature and discuss them both positively and negatively in terms of the impact upon participation. So what I've done here is I've just given you an example, okay? I'm going to put this paper up on Sims Capital, but if you look here, I've put up a paper by Stephen Bradbury, and he's looked at black minority ethnic groups' participation in football clubs in the East Midlands. Now what you can see straight away is he's focused in on black minority and ethnic groups. So that's given him a focus. Secondly, he's focused upon football, which is giving him a specific focus. Now I don't know as an undergraduate in year one whether you need to go into that much depth, but once you go into your second and third year, you need to start to think about taking a particular focus. Now his key themes, I've just gone through the paper and highlighted them for you. So he's got three key themes. The first one is racism and institutional racism in football. So it's the culture surrounding football, and there is a culture looking at historically the factors of racism and institutional racism and how they've developed as to influence and participation. His second theme that he's looked at is cultural identity, and his cultural identity for black minority ethnic groups. Now, in fact, Bradbury focuses specifically upon Asian and South Asian groups because there's an underrepresentation of them within football. So again, that particular context has basically driven his focus. And they will have a specific cultural identity which is different to Afro-Caribbean groups. Okay, they'll have a specific focus which is different to other BME groups, so other parts of Asia, other parts of Australasia, and so on. His final theme is looking at multi-ethnic leisure spaces. So looking at a space that people from black minority and ethnic groups feel comfortable in. Now, if you look at his work, you'll see that he has, within his literature review and within his results and discussion, taken work from other people to support this research. So effectively, he is what we would call synthesizing and bringing those themes together. He hasn't talked about so-and-so's paper says this, so-and-so's paper said this, and just listed. But what he has done is he's brought that literature together about racism and institutional racism in football, about cultural identity of South Asian groups and of multi-ethnic leisure spaces. And that's what you've got to do. If we move on, you then see Kay's work. Okay, now Kay's done something slightly different in she's looked at family influences. So she has focused upon those societal influences and those societal institutions, and she's focused on Muslim young women's participation. So she has gone very specific in her focus. She's got a very specific group in gender, and she's got a very specific group in family influences. Now for me, this is, for you guys, you don't need to go that specific. Family influences might be a theme within gender, or that might be a theme within black minority ethnic groups. But it doesn't have to be your specific focus, because she's studying something in depth at a higher level. You know, she's gone into that. But what you can see again, if you look at her work, is cultural identity is a key theme. Family views on activity is a key theme, and the role of a Muslim woman is a key theme. It appears in her literature review, and it appears in her results and discussion. And the way she has structured her paper is to look at those. So again, it's just reinforcing when you come to do your literature review, please, 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 approach it in that way. Don't list what other people have said. Don't mix up different groups. Find the themes from what other people have said and bring them together. Cultural identity, she's probably found 4 or 5 other authors who've talked about cultural identity. Family views on activity and the role of Muslim women. But what she hasn't done is just list their findings. She's brought it all together and worded it in her own way to discuss these themes. Okay? So they're just a couple of examples of academic papers which have looked at a couple of areas. And as you can see, that they're focused and they've highlighted specific themes to look at. The final task which I'm going to ask you to do is to find one article looking at one personal field or societal field and tweet the link of the paper and the key themes. Alright? So I want you to find either one paper that looks at either gender, looks at class, looks at race, or looks at disability. It might be family influence. I would possibly avoid that. It might be the media. Again, I would possibly avoid that, because I think what you've got there for this level of research is possibly something which may be more theme related, okay? But what I want you to do is find that one article looking at one personal field, and what I want you to then do is tweet the key themes from that to me. Alright, so using our hashtags again, PSC4001 and sport participation. Now to do that, what I would ask you to do is to use either Google Scholar or EBSCO-host. I'm just going to go out and I'm just going to show you Google Scholar because I think it's key to get your search terms right. So if I go onto Google, what you can see I've got here is I've got the option for the different apps. Okay, so if I click on that and go to more, it should give me the option of even more from Google. And if I go down to this option here, Scholar, it will then provide me with peer-reviewed journals on this topic. If I was to search Afro-Caribbean participation and sport, what it would do is give me research articles for that particular group. So it said to me, did you mean Afro-Caribbean? I've put a spelling mistake in. But what you can now see is dominant discourses about race and ethnicity and gender, sports practice and performance, and so on. So they come up with different papers on that. Now these are your key terms here, okay? And as you go through, you can use these to inform your search. So again, there's another paper down here, How Physically Active Are South Asians in the United Kingdom, literature review. All that I'm going to ask you to do is go on there, find a piece of literature. If you want to make it fairly recent and relevant, you might want to put the custom range in, since 2000. If you then click the search, it should give you slightly more up-to-date ones. And if you click on that article, you'll be able to read that article. So if it says about physiological cardiac adaptation, I would avoid that because that's not necessarily about participation. And there's a lot of, we're now getting a lot of more physiological research coming up. But if we were to go back, hopefully we get a slightly different term of things. Okay, and again, if I was to change the search terms to BME, participation, and sport, straight away I get different papers coming up. Okay, so assessing the contribution of out-of-school hours learning sports activity to sport participation by Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. So again, you click on those papers, you can get that information. Alright, so that's the task that I want you guys to do. Alright, and if you can tweet that at me, that'd be fantastic. The last thing I want to do is, look, there's the reference list. I'm not going to spend a long time going through that. The only thing that I'm going to say is take some time to have a look at some of these journals. If you can see here, 2 of the journal articles come from the International Review of the Sociology of Sport. And if you're looking for literature in this area, I think they'd be very useful journal articles. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope it didn't bore you too much. Any questions, again, tweet at me, email me, anything like that, and we can go from there. And hopefully this will help inform when you look at some of the other topics in the other podcasts as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope that I haven't been too dull and haven't bored you too much. Keep the tweets coming, okay?